genesis of the book was, of course, your own personal blindside. For you, was that a why me moment?
It wasn't so much why me as just that it made the kind of things that appear on my TV show every night feel a bit closer to home. Because I think as a journalist, and then particularly as the host of 7:30, every single night there will be somebody on my show who has gotten out of bed and been living their regular life, and it's looked like an ordinary day, and then something happens on that day that makes it far from an ordinary day. It's a life-changing day. And the news is just basically over and over again repeated that type of thing, just with different circumstances. And then the next day, it's that thing again. And you rarely hear what happens to people, you know, after people have been just devastated by something, what happens a year later, what happens 5 years later, what happens 20 years later. And I'd had a sort of run of things happen to me in 2014 that had really sort of destabilised me and just gave me a sense of how fragile every aspect of life is, and sort of rammed home in a very personal way the message I was getting every night at work. And so I decided, I often would do things like, if there were stories on the show that I found really hard to watch, I would say, can you turn the volume down on this? I can't, you know, listen to what's happening to this person. And so I was sort of really scared of it. I didn't want to think about these kind of blindsides. And I ended up deciding, you know what, I can't ignore that because it is part of life. It's a very common experience. And so I thought, okay, I'm going to actually do the opposite and walk towards it and study it and see what I learn. And I was quite fearful about starting that because I thought, wow, this could really tip me into depression, or it just might be too much, might be really traumatising. But it was actually the opposite. It was actually very hopeful and life-affirming.
Well, we're going to talk about some of the things that you learned. Can we talk a little bit firstly about our fear of blindsides? Because in some cases, and quite often, it's a case of that could have happened to me. It's a very rational response, even if it's very unlikely to happen to you.
Yep. The human brain is basically wired to like predictability and certainty. And that's because when you go back and look at our ancient ancestors, they faced threats from all sorts of things, and safety was basically in numbers. So you wanted to keep your tribe as big as possible and, you know, alive. And so basically predictability was really useful, because if you'd eaten one plant safely before, that would mean that you could eat that same plant safely again. And so because predictability was so important to survival, we all have evolved to actually prefer predictability. So when you see something like the Lindt Cafe siege happen, that is very unsettling to us, because what we understand is if I go into a cafe and order a coffee and sit down, that's not going to transform my life. So something like the Lindt Cafe siege happens and we feel all rattled because all of a sudden we can't have that assurance that doing an activity like that is actually something that we can do safely. So our brains basically like to know what's coming. There's been all sorts of studies that have done that have shown this. That one of the most famous ones found that people would prefer pushing a button that delivered a small guaranteed electric shock than pushing a button that would maybe or maybe not give the electric shock. So basically people feel better knowing what's coming, even if what's coming is painful, than not knowing. And so blindsides are particularly threatening to people because of how we have evolved, and because they were the sorts of things that for our ancient ancestors were to be greatly feared, because a blindside could wipe out the entire tribe. So we've also evolved our fears. Scientists have been able to map our fears basically according to something called dread risk, and blindsides are the kind of things that have high dread risk. So for example, anything that causes a lot of deaths at once, widespread destruction, is said to have high dread risk. So terrorist attack, nuclear accident, things of that nature, gun massacre. A low dread risk event is something that's a danger to us, but it is more predictable. So like a fall from a ladder or death from smoking. We feel like we know the risks of those things and that they're things within our control, so they feel less threatening to us than things with high dread risk that seem very uncontrollable and unpredictable. So that low dread risk and high dread risk is why most of us are more scared of a plane flight than of the drive to the airport, even though
is more dangerous.
The drive to the airport is way more dangerous.
Yeah. I'd never heard of this term. What is it? Black swans.
A black swan is an event that there's no way of foreseeing that it would happen. And it's named because when British explorers came to Australia, they'd only ever seen white swans, and when they arrived in Australia, they saw black swans for the first time. So it's basically the sort of catastrophic event that you could not have foreseen coming. So sometimes it'll be, like say the Asian tsunami in 2004, that would be a black swan event because it's just the scale of the catastrophe is so huge. The Thredbo landslide would be another one that you know, very unlikely that you would foresee an event like that happening where an entire road would collapse and wipe out everybody. Port Arthur massacre, 35 people killed by a lone gunman. They're not things that you would generally anticipate or mitigate against because the scale of them is so shocking and off the charts, you wouldn't think that something like that would happen.
And these high dread risks, we elevate them because they are so remarkable. You explain in your book this, why it is that we elevate them, but also explain a little bit about why we have a right to have a fear of them, and that is this, there's a mathematical reason for it, the law of large numbers.
Yeah, so we elevate these things, so the high dread risk events are much less likely to kill us, but they really stick in our brains, and it's because they defy any sense of predictability. And as I said, we're hardwired to like predictability, and we find unpredictable things particularly threatening. So when you see something on the news like the Lindt Cafe siege or a plane crash, your brain basically puts that in neon lights because it finds it very threatening. And so that will play on your mind like, oh, geez, I could have been in the Lindt Cafe, oh, you know, or when that Dreamworld accident happened, I remember thinking, oh, geez, I wouldn't let my kids go on a ride like that anymore. And I'm thinking it as I drive my kids home in the car, which, as we said, is way more people died last year in car crashes than have died in roller coaster accidents. So it's basically that your brain's putting them in neon lights. But even though your brain's doing that, it does not mean that you are more likely to be affected by an accident like that. So say the law of large numbers is basically a mathematical theory where when you take a very large sample of people, so say like a whole country worth of people, the chance of weird, remote, dangerous things happening is greatly magnified. And the more people you have, the more weird and unusual things will happen. But that doesn't mean that your chance is any greater of that thing happening personally to you. You'll hear about these events, particularly in this age of social media, because things can be so easily shared. But the chance of you, being personally in something like the Lindt Cafe is very remote.
The law of large numbers also, though, puts some perspective around the near-miss stories that we hear, because often we hear about, the Lindt Cafe, many people talked about, I was going to get a coffee that day, or I usually get a coffee and I was distracted or the phone rang, whatever it was. One of the people that you spoke to, who was a survivor of the Lindt Cafe, talks about this rat bag delusion that you can somehow escape being part of that law of large numbers.
Yeah, and that I think it ties with our need for predictability, which is that to make sense of the world around us, your brain's always looking for patterns because patterns are predictable, and cause and effect is really useful in terms of explaining how the world works. So we are hardwired to look for reasons why things happen. So all the time after events like the Lindt Cafe, you'll see people go, oh, well, geez, I was meant to be there, but I changed my plans at the last minute. And they feel like that must have happened for a reason, that it's a very narcissistic way to look at the world, that, I was spared. But what you're really saying is, the logical extension of that is the 18 people in the cafe did something to deserve to be there, or they were there for a reason. But actually things like this happen just so utterly randomly. There's often not a reason for these kind of things to happen. But, I noticed it again. There was another person in the book I interviewed, Walter Mikac, whose wife and 6-year-old and 3-year-old were killed in the Port Arthur massacre. And sometimes when I've said to friends or people that I've been interviewing Walter Mikac, they've said, oh, I could not survive if that happened to my children. And it's the most incredibly... people don't realise it, but it's a really narcissistic thing to say, because what you're saying is, I must love my children more than Walter Mikac loved his because he's survived that, but I wouldn't survive it. I love my children so much that I wouldn't survive it. It's this idea that, you're exceptional as a human being, but actually nobody is exceptional.
So just going back to high dread, it obviously, these events can affect our behaviour, and you give an interesting example of post 9/11, how people change their behaviour and actually put themselves in greater risk, in low dread risk, rather than high dread risk.
So, in the years after 9/11, people became fearful of going on planes because they feared a terrorist attack. And some researchers in the US gathered some data. More people took car trips. So, in the US for Thanksgiving and Christmas, a lot more people drove in the year after 9/11 than previously, and air travel was down. So, when you looked at road fatalities in that period, road fatalities were close to 3,000 more deaths up. So, almost as many people died from road fatalities after 9/11 as had actually died in 9/11 because they altered their behaviour. And we do things as well like, say for example in Australia, you are far more likely to die of heart disease than you are from a terrorist attack. Heart disease is the number one killer. But the government spends about $7 billion a year on heart disease programs. It spends about $35 billion a year on terrorism and national security. So we spend a lot more money on something that we're at less risk from because we are just more scared of it.
So what you get to is that it's not just an individual influence, these high dread risks and the fear of them. It affects the thinking, the collective thinking of organisations, corporate and government. And so it really plays into the way that public money or corporate money is spent and the sort of preparations that they make for probably events that are very marginal.
Yeah, and it's, I think, good for us to sort of be aware of that and to think and to try to, I think, resist changing your behaviour. Like for me, really, after the Dreamworld thing, I shouldn't alter my behaviour at all. That's irrational to alter your behaviour. But it's interesting because all of these little strange ways that our human brains think, nearly all of them actually are so predictable and so easily occur to everybody that most of them are explained by theory. So even the calculation that I made in the car about the Dreamworld ride, where I'm thinking, oh, I probably won't let the boys go on a ride like that again because if something happened, I couldn't live with myself because it's a voluntary activity. Like we didn't have to be in harm's way by doing that. That calculation is actually a branch of mathematics called minimax regret, which is that you make a decision in the present day based on what you might come to regret in the future. So I thought like I was just uniquely crazy, but it turns out that that is very predictable human behaviour.
Well, I wonder then whether you could extrapolate that then to our spending on terrorism, that, there is a small risk. If we don't spend all of that money, perhaps something will happen. Certainly a government would regret, a community would regret.
Yeah, it's a really difficult thing to work out because, as you say, if you reduced spending on terrorism, you might find that you have more deaths from terrorism would occur, and also the community feeling safe is worth spending money on, even though it's sort of an unquantifiable thing. So it's really difficult, but people send their message to governments about what they want money spent on based on who they elect. So if most of us weren't comfortable with that, we'd probably agitate more about it.
Let's talk about the role of the media. Last night I watched 7:30. My favourite presenter was there.
Excellent.
And the top billing story was a plane crash. And even though I'd read your book and understood that there's all these mathematical and psychological reasons why I might be interested in a plane crash, I zoomed into that story.
Here.
I'd been on an Air Niugini flight years and years ago. And I probably won't be on one anytime soon, but I needed to know all of the details.
Same here. And I was glued to that story. And I know that it's because my brain is wired to want every bit of detail because I'm wired to view a sort of event like that as particularly threatening. And so my brain wants all the information because it wants to try to either soothe myself that, oh, well, that wouldn't happen to you because you wouldn't be in the Pacific Islands, or, it's looking for a reason why that's something that's not threatening. So, yeah, that's why, like 7:30's ratings will go up, say around the time of the Lindt Cafe siege or particular disasters, the ratings go up because people want to watch these things.
Absolutely, and that's what I wanted to get to, is that this is very much consumer driven. In the end, we're looking to maximise our audiences, whether it's the ABC or commercial, and we're giving people what they want, aren't we? I mean, I guess it sort of goes to that question of the responsibility of journalism.
Yeah, and that the nature of news is that 99 helicopters fly today and the one that doesn't is the one that's on the news, because the things that break the patterns are the things that we find interesting and threatening, and so that's why we tend to focus on them, basically. So I think it's also an issue that there's two forces that sort of actually are diametrically opposed. One is we see something like, say, the Port Arthur massacre on the news and the ratings go up and we're all watching it and we're trying to understand it and grapple with it, and we watch someone like Walter Mikak who's lost his whole family and we think, oh geez, imagine if that happened to me, blah, 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 how would I go on? But for the person actually who's at the centre of the reality, Walter Mikak, what he finds in real life is that people start avoiding him because they can't stand being up too close to the reality of that. They don't know what to say, it's awkward, it's uncomfortable. So it's like watching these things on the news allows us to grapple with these big questions about life in a way that it's too uncomfortable to do in person.
I'm going to pick up on some of that because it goes to the very heart of, I guess, our compassion in these very traumatic events, especially. Just, the fact that news is so, I guess, driven by numbers, and we have a product that we're presenting. The checkbooks come out in these events. The ABC doesn't have a checkbook, as everybody would acknowledge, but certainly the checkbooks come out. You spoke to James Scott. He was a Brisbane medical student. Many people might remember him. If I mention Mars Bar, you might remember him. So he was the poor chap who was lost in a snowstorm. He had an incredible story of survival. But I was here reporting. I was a cub reporter at the time here in Brisbane, and I remember the media turning on him.
Oh, it was massive,
and it was terrible. No, and in the end, because there was sort of this question about the consistency in his story, he was pilloried. Now, you spoke to him about that. What did he sort of describe as his experience at that time?
It was fascinating. He's a professor of psychiatry now he works at UQ and at Royal Brisbane Hospital. The unfortunate thing for people when they find themselves in the middle of a massive story is that that's when there's peak media interest, but that's when they're at their most vulnerable and probably they're least able to make a good decision about what they should do. And so James Scott was a young medical student in his 20s. He'd gone hiking in Nepal where he was on like a medical internship. He'd by his own admission, being a bloody idiot, he'd separated from his companion. He didn't have enough supplies in his bag, and then he'd gotten lost. And he was sort of given up for dead, and then the family paid for one final helicopter search, and they found him about 42 days in. Nobody could believe it. It still is one of the most incredible survival tales ever. It was written up in an American medical journal, and they said, aspects of it are truly inexplicable. It's a miracle this guy survived. So he had a really good sort of survival story to tell, but he wasn't really well enough straight off the bat to do it. And also this very improbable detail took really strong hold, which was that he reportedly had a Mars bar. That was the only food that he had for the whole time. He's actually told me for the book, for the first time, that it was not a Mars bar, it was just a plain block of Cadbury's dairy milk. This detail was what everyone wanted to know. What was the chocolate bar? And so it became this crazy sort of frenzy. And he was, if you have a bushfire or something, there's the media loads shared among more people. This was a story where there was only one person, like Stuart Diver in Thredbo, one person at the centre of everyone wanting him. And in James's case, it was also not just Australian media, it was international. The family didn't have any media experience, and they were just deluged and overwhelmed. And so James's dad worked at UQ, and he went to the UQ media people and said, what should we do? And they said, you've got to get someone to handle it for you. You should ring Harry and Miller, who was a celebrity agent. So they did, because they needed help. And initially it was great because it stopped, all the media then went to Harry and the family wasn't sort of under siege. But James was concerned that my family's, spent tens of thousands of dollars looking for me. James was really quite catastrophically ill. He had, and still has, sort of double vision. His vision shakes. His balance was destroyed because he was so malnourished. And he thought, who knows if this is ever going to get better? I don't know if I'll ever be able to work again, and I need some money. And so they agreed to sell the story to 60 Minutes. And Harry and Miller gave James some advice, which is, whatever you do, don't say what the chocolate bar is, because that's the detail everyone wants, and we'll be able to get some endorsement or something like that, so just don't say. And so the media then, once 60 Minutes stitched up the deal, it's sort of a vacuum from the Scots. There's nothing coming out. Everyone else wants a story and they've got to keep it going because it's so amazing. So then the stories all start up. Well, can this guy really be trusted? Who could possibly have lasted all that time? Then James did the 60 Minutes interview. Richard Carlton, who was the journo doing it, asked what was the chocolate bar, and James wouldn't answer it. And so he looked shifty. And that played into the thing about, oh, well, can we really trust this guy, and, you know, blah, blah, blah. And so poor James, all these years later, in hindsight, says he was just devastated because he felt like this is an incredible survival story and all anyone will talk about is the stupid chocolate bar, which really had no bearing on my survival whatsoever. And so he felt, you know, like he had been very burned by that experience, and just felt he had one interview with a journalist overseas that he said was better because the person just allowed him to talk about what had happened to him, and it wasn't as sort of sensational as the 60 Minutes interview.
It was too late by then.
It was too late by then, and he found the whole experience just very scarring. And unfortunately, the sort of lessons James learned out of it, you only learn usually when you've been through it. You don't know at the time.
Exactly. But Leigh, you admit that you would have gone hard with James in a similar interview.
Well, I used, after James's story, I then looked at the way the media reports on these things and looked a bit at what I've done in my own career and whatnot. And I listened to everything that James said to me and all the concerns he had about what had happened to him. And I ended up basically thinking I would have done all the things that James was upset about. I think I would have done as a journo exactly the same thing. I would have definitely been chasing the Scott family and ringing them relentlessly to try to get the story. If I hadn't got the interview with James, I would have been looking for other angles, and those angles probably would have included the credibility of the story. And I definitely would have asked about the chocolate bar if I were the journo doing the interview. And if he hadn't answered that, I definitely would have gone fairly hard because the network had paid for the story. So once you've accepted the money, you can't then be selective about what details you're withholding. But I didn't want to blindside James by, you know, he's given me this, been very generous and given me all his time, and then I don't want to write in the book that I disagree with James. So I sent him that section of the book to say, look, I just want you to know that I would have done exactly the same thing. And what do you think about that? And he was great. He came back and said, I completely get that because all of these things that you've said are just native to your profession. Like, that's what your profession does. And I think some people in your profession do it better than others because, like human beings generally, some people are empathetic and some people aren't empathetic. But he said, I just think that journos need to think more that the person at the centre of the story is a person. They're not just a character in a story. And he felt, even today, he said he wouldn't go a week without somebody making a Mars bar gag. And, you know, he became that guy. But he had a very good message, I thought, which was that life goes on, you know, that he's not just the Mars bar guy, that was one thing that happened to him in his life when he was in his early 20s. And since then, he's had a very rich and amazing life. You know, he's not just that guy.
The Mars bar guy.
Yeah.
I wonder, though, whether it goes to real questions about the responsibility of the media in these circumstances. Clearly we want the story, the public wants the story, but there is very often a deeply traumatised individual or family that you're dealing with.
Yeah, and the University of Melbourne's done some interesting research. They went and talked to people who'd been involved in the Black Saturday bushfires. There's not a lot of research that's been done into questions like, why do people talk to journalists in a disaster? Because not everyone does. Like, some people will and some people won't. So what makes the people who talk want to talk? And then also there's a lack of research about if they have agreed to talk, how do they feel about that decision later? And the University of Melbourne attempted a little bit of research into that. And there's a researcher in Queensland who's done a little bit of looking at that in relation to the Toowoomba floods as well. And what they found is that people often, in some cases, quite often, they couldn't even remember speaking to a journalist because they were so traumatised at the time. They would sometimes feel used if the journalist just got the information and then they never heard from them ever again. They sort of felt like they wanted a bit of follow-up. And often the reasons people gave for talking were things like they didn't want it to happen to someone else, or they wanted people to understand the reality of what had occurred. And I think, journos obviously, we're profiting from other people's misery, from the terrible things that happen to other people. So I think that there is an obligation on us to make sure that we go about getting those people's stories in caring ways and in ways that are not going to add at all to the trauma and difficulties that they've gone through. Because you think, say with James Scott, when he accepted whatever the money was that he got from Channel 9, what James was paid, and the reason James was paid, was because that was a fraction of what Channel 9 would have made from getting that story, because of the advertising rates they would have been able to charge for 60 Minutes. So Nine's profiting from that story. It's James Scott's story. Why should James Scott not be allowed? I've often thought myself, even though I work for the ABC, that if something catastrophic happened in my family to my brother or somebody like that, I would counsel them to get money for the story.
I think you'd get a media manager first, wouldn't you?
You'd get somebody, yeah. You'd assign one of your journo mates to take the calls, and then I would say, if my brother had his leg beaten by a shark or something, I would say you should try to get what money you can because they're making money from you.
It's a product. It's interesting, though, because there's a foil to James Scott's story, and that is Stuart Diver, the Thredbo landslide survivor. He similarly was under extraordinary media attention, and he was also paid to give his story in exclusive.
And also had Harry M. Miller.
But he had a really different experience.
Yeah, he did, and for a few different reasons. But Stuart, was 18 people died. Stuart was the sole survivor. So like James, he was one person at the centre of a gigantic amount of interest. He did also sell his story, which went to Channel 7. But he was very happy with the way Harry M. Miller managed him, because Stuart felt like the way that the story was framed was that it was a good news story and it was a tale of survival and all of that sort of stuff, and that it was a very positive thing. And Stuart said even today people will come up to him and say really positive things. But the issue for Stuart became, because Stuart said, he didn't want to be the clown, crying on TV about losing his wife and all the rest of it. And so he tried actively to put out this positive message like you can survive anything, you can get through anything. Because Stuart had he'd been underground for, I can't remember how many hours now, like 50 hours, if not more, in freezing water up to his neck. His wife had died right in front of him. He was like just as physically, emotionally, every possible way under the most enormous stress. But then he came out and his message was sort of positive, you can get through anything. And he said what the effect of that was that his grieving was sort of delayed, and coming to terms with what had happened to him was delayed, because he had to keep putting on this positive image all the time, when actually not only had his wife died, he of course knew all the other people who'd died as well. It was this huge weight of grief for him to work through, and it just took a toll on him down the track.
We often in the media, and I think broadly in the community, look for a hero in these stories.
Definitely.
And going back to last night's story on 7:30, the central part of the story was the Australian hero. How does that sort of play into how we're managing our fears about these blindsides?
I think that it's partly because we probably would like to think that in that circumstance maybe we would be like that, that we would do the right thing and help others and all of the rest of it. But you don't actually know until you are in that circumstance what sort of person you're going to turn out to be. You don't know until you're tested. So I guess it's partly that we hope that. And I think also when something really awful has happened, you're looking for things that reaffirm your faith, I guess, in human nature. So say after the Lindt Cafe thing, when all the people are putting flowers out and we're not going to change our way of life because of this and all the rest of it, that's because we're trying to get reassurance and reclaim all the good things about life and not think that, everything about life is evil. So say, if there's a plane crash and there's somebody who's heroic, or Thredbo, 18 people die in this senseless, awful thing, and Stuart Diver survives, it's more comforting to think about Stuart Diver's survival than it is to think about the other 18 deaths.
You mentioned James Scott's been forever defined about this chocolate bar. I mean, most of the individuals that you spoke to for this book were well known in the public and have become defined by their tragedy as well. I mean, people like Stuart Diver and Walter Mikac. They become public property, and we expect a lot of them. So decades on, we still want their story. What's driving that?
I think that they just become people like we feel that we know, and so we want to know what's happened to them. So, for example, Anita Cobby, when her father Gary died, I think he was like in his late 80s or something, there was an article in the paper about, the father of Anita Cobby has died. And it's because we remain invested in, what's happened to them next, what are they doing now? And so, you always see the anniversary stories around Thredbo or Port Arthur or those big stories. There'll always be something featuring one of these people and what's happened to them. So if you do have the misfortune to find yourself, like Lindy Chamberlain or somebody like that, in the centre of a gigantic story that captures national intense media interest, your life's never fully your own ever again, because you remain recognisable to people, or your story does, your name does, and journos will always come knocking. Like Stuart Diver said to me, and I had never thought about this, but he said every time there's some sort of underground tragedy, like a mine thing or like that cave thing that happened in Thailand, journos ring him because they want him to talk about what it's like to be trapped underground. And yeah, I'd never thought about that.
Does that re-traumatise him? Did he talk about that?
I think not for Stuart, because he's he doesn't usually do those sort of interviews, but he's a very unique personality who's quite, personality type influences a lot how people come through these things. And Stuart says, I was a very resilient person before all of this happened, and having met him, I don't doubt that is true. So the person he was before all this happened is undoubtedly some of the reasons why he's still a functional person. Because the other thing with Stuart is, as well as losing his first wife in Thredbo, very sadly his second wife died not that long ago from breast cancer. So the poor bugger has had a really, really terrible run of life events. So he's now a single dad to, she was 4 when I met her, she'll be 6 now, little 6-year-old. And he's just had to sort of, just get out of bed every day and keep going.
Yeah, in fact, it was Stuart, but Louise Hope, also you from the Lint Cafe's Siege, was another person who has been blindsided more than once. And you sort of delve into this notion that we'd like to think that if something terrible is going to happen in your life, that's it. You've had your fair share. Yeah. You're off the hook now.
There's so much magical thinking, I think, in life, from things like, I do this all the time, I'll be driving up to a red light, I'll think, if it turns green before I fully stop the car, I'll get Malcolm Turnbull for that interview tonight. If I end up stopping the car, I'll go, best of 3, I'll do it for the next 3 traffic lights. Because we're trying to impose control on our life, all the time. So, sorry, what was the question?
So this notion that a tragedy or a trauma is only going to hit you once.
Yeah, that's right. So you think, Stuart Diver's wife died in Thredbo, so therefore that's his allotment of tragedy for his life. But unfortunately, life doesn't work like that. And so that's why, it seems like some people have, all the run of bad luck, and other people seem to get all the run of good luck. Having one bad thing that's happened to you isn't like some magical amulet that you wear around your neck that stops any other bad things happening to you, which seems completely obvious and logical, and yet we tend to not think like that. So Louisa Hope was a woman with MS, and she was one of the hostages in the Link Cafe. And I got the Australian Bureau of Statistics to help me crunch what are the odds for any one Australian of ticking both of those boxes. And the odds were 1.13 billion. So when I sat down with Louisa, I said, obviously initially when the siege began, it's complete pandemonium and chaos and panic. But I said, as it went on over the hours, at any point did you think, are you effing kidding me? I've got MS and now I have to be a hostage in a terrorist drama?
With my mother?
With my mother? And she said no, that she had already grappled a lot with the question of life being fair or unfair because of her MS. And so she already had a bit of an understanding of, well, I'm not exceptional and bad things can happen to me. And so she was somebody who didn't feel like, why has this happened to me? It was almost like, well, why would this not happen to me? Things happen to people, and that's how you are. Same with Stuart Diver as well. Stuart said something that I just thought was so sad, which was when we first started talking and we were talking about both wives dying, he said, nobody says this to my face, but I know that everybody says it behind my back. They all say, who would sign up to be the third Mrs. Diver? And I felt so bad for him. And I know that people do say that, because when I've said to them I'm interviewing Stuart Diver, people have said similar things, like, oh, he's jinxed. So again, I rang
Magical thinking.
Magical thinking. So again, I rang my mate at the Bureau of Statistics. I think they've blocked my number now and said, can you help me calculate the odds of Stuart Diver being widowed a third time? I want to debunk this idea that Stuart Diver's jinxed. And so what we did was we looked at Stuart Diver's first wife, Sally, was killed in a very rare, random freak event for which nobody could possibly blame Stuart Diver. Once he remarried, his odds then of becoming a widower reset. And then sadly, he had the misfortune to lose his second wife, Rosanna, in something very common, breast cancer, which about 1 in 4,000 women die. So Stuart had one very rare thing followed by one quite common thing. Now, it's a bit like flipping a coin, the chance of, Stuart's wives dying. When you throw, those events are their own discrete events. When you throw a coin in the air, it's a 50-50. From the moment it goes up in the air, it's 50-50 if it's going to be heads or tails. It doesn't matter if you've tossed 10 heads in a row, that does not make it more likely that you're going to get tails next. Once it goes up, it's 50-50. So that's the same with Stuart Diver losing 2 wives. Losing the first wife doesn't make you more or less likely to lose the second wife. They're their own discrete events. Nonetheless, the more of the same thing you have in a row, the more unusual the experience. So there is no causal link there. So the next Mrs. Diver, let's say next year she comes along, she doesn't need to have any fear for her longevity based on the fact that his other 2 wives died, because we've just established they're their own discrete events. Now, she might have a slightly elevated risk of dying in a skiing accident, because he's head of operations at Thredbo, so I'll go skiing a lot. She might have a slightly elevated risk compared to the average woman of dying in a travel accident, because Stuart likes travelling, she might travel with him. But she doesn't have an elevated risk of dying because the other 2 wives died or because he has some jinx. The reality is that the next person most likely to die in the Diver household is Stuart Diver himself, because the odds for men in Australia is that they tend to live shorter lives than the average Australian woman. So he is the next most likely person to die. Having said that, we know, because we've met Louisa Hope and she's 1 in 1.3 billion, that sometimes someone is the one to whom bad things happen. So we can't say that just because Stuart Diver's had a tragic past, it doesn't mean he's going to have a happy ending, but nor does a tragic past make him more susceptible to a tragic future.
It's the law of large numbers again.
Yeah, exactly. I said, after I worked all of that out, I rang Michael Wilson at the Bureau of Statistics, or I sent it to him and said, can you read this? Because it's actually very complex to work out all the probability and statistics around that. Can you read this and make sure I've got it right? And he emailed me back and said, that is a flawless piece of logic, but I still think people will go, yeah, well, I still think Stuart Diver's jinxed.
Leigh, I've got a question from the audience. Which of your interviewees generated the most trepidation for you, and why?
Any time that it's somebody with a awful event in their life that you're about to make them revisit, I'm always very, trepidatious about that, because it's really hard to make somebody talk about things like that. And I, have the normal human compulsion that it's scary to ask somebody. I'm better at it now, actually, after doing this book, but it's scary to talk to people about the worst things that have ever happened to them. And it's uncomfortable because you can't help but think about, imagine if that happened to me, that'd be so awful. But now, having done this book, I feel a bit more at ease with it. Like, I interviewed Matthew Lowe, whose wife Cindy Lowe was one of the people who was killed in Dreamworld, and he wanted to do the interview because the coronial inquest is going on, and he wants to make sure that there's enough focus on it that other people don't go through something similar. And so I felt like, going into it, well, that's a worthy goal for him to have, and I would like to do what I can to facilitate him to tell his story so that he can feel that he's done something purposeful and made something positive come from what has happened to their family. And I've learned as well, just through the research and from many interviews with people who've been traumatised, that there's a certain way to do those interviews, and it's to sit back as much as you can and let the other person sort of steer it. And also to not force them into areas which are going to be very difficult. So sometimes people will go to areas themselves, and then I feel like it's fine to follow. But I wouldn't, say for example with Walter Mikac, I would not ask him outright what it was like when he had to go to the crime scene. But if Walter raised that, then I would maybe talk about that. Like Walter, when I spoke to him, talked about how he was a pharmacist, and he said sometimes people would see my car at my pharmacy and, you know, they were speculating about what I was doing there. So he was alluding to the fact that people thought that he would kill himself. And I would not have asked Walter this just out of the blue, but because he was the one who raised it, I felt like that gave me permission to say, and I would often phrase difficult questions by saying things like, please don't feel that you have to answer this if I'm being too intrusive, but just what you've said there about the car and whatnot, obviously you're alluding that people think that you would kill yourself. Why, nobody has more means or knowledge than a pharmacist to do that. What stopped you? And then because he's the one who's gone there, he's very comfortable then, or I don't know if very comfortable is the right term or words, but he is comfortable to answer it. And so he said, I definitely thought about it, but my parents, you know, the thought of my parents stopped me because they had suffered a lot as well. They'd lost their grandchildren, and I didn't think that I could do that to them. So I think that sometimes if you just, like say with Matthew Lowe, whose wife died at Dreamworld, I never asked what happened, like, at the moment, because people don't need to know that. No. People that want to know that is sort of like a morbid curiosity, but there's actually no public benefit in knowing the details of what happened right there. The benefit's in knowing what was happening in the lead up and what was the response like after. We don't need to know. The coroner does, and people like that need to know, but the general public doesn't need to know that. And so then I think, well, then that's not my right to have to make him talk about such a terrible thing that he witnessed. And so I think there's ways to do these interviews, but those are the kind of interviews that normally make me feel the most like, all right, I've got to really think about this.
You talked about Walter, but quite a number of the people that you spoke to for your book talked about the kind of responses they got immediately after the trauma, or actually even during the trauma, or immediately after the trauma. You know, the kind of rejection that they got from friends, that people were so afraid of the trauma that this person had endured that they couldn't face that friend. It's a terrible thing to think that at your worst moment, people are finding it too difficult to deal with.
Yeah, and the theme came up from a number of people that I interviewed, that they would have to be the one to put other people at ease. Like Michael Spence, who's the Vice-Chancellor of Sydney University, his wife died suddenly. She was diagnosed with cancer, and 3 weeks later she died. They had 5 children. The littlest one was 4. He'd only fairly recently been appointed Sydney Uni Vice-Chancellor. It was absolutely terrible. And he went to see a priest, and the priest said, when you go back to work, you're going to have to be the person that makes everyone feel at ease. And Michael was like, what? You know, I'm the one whose wife just died. I'm the one who's a widow with 5 children. But the reality was that if Michael didn't do that, it wouldn't get raised because people were too scared, and then it became this awkward thing. So Michael would go into meetings and say, before we start the meeting, I just want to say thank you very much, everybody, for all the lovely messages I've received about the death of Beth. And he would have to do it. Walter had a situation with a friend where he had to tell the friend it was okay. It's a very common thing. And
what did you take from that?
I took from that, I felt so bad for them. And actually it took me talking to a priest who I interviewed to help me understand that. Because when they would tell me, Michael and Walter, these stories, I would think, oh, I understand that from the person. Because I was, say with Walter, I was thinking, yeah, I was scared to come here to talk to you. Like, I get that.
And it's not a lack of compassion.
It's not a lack of compassion, it's fear. It's because it's some deep thing in your head that you fear that happening to you, and so you don't want to be around it. This priest, I said to him, you know, how do you know the right thing to say? Because Walter had said something that made a big impact on me, which was people would often say, well, I didn't want to ring you, or I didn't want to come around because I was worried I'd say something that would make it worse. And Walter said, and that's a very common thing that people think, and Walter said, my wife and my 3-year-old and my 6-year-old had been killed. Like, what did anyone think they could say that can make that worse? Like, you cannot make that worse. And it was, very sort of, again, selfish way of thinking. And so this priest, Steve Sin, his name was, Father Sin, he said to me, I said, what if you say the wrong thing? And or how do you know not to say the wrong thing? And he said, so what if you say the wrong thing? I said, well, it'd be terrible. Like, you might make it worse. He's like, so? Like, you're there to just be there. Like, it doesn't matter what you say. The thing that you've got to send the message that you're there to, and he used the word accompany, to accompany people. Because if you're accompanying your friends to the pub when times are good, well, it's pretty crap if you don't accompany them when things aren't so good. And it's not about you. When you think about, I might say something that makes it worse, you're making it about yourself, not about the other person. And so him explaining that, I found quite liberating. And then I had a friend who had terminal cancer when I was towards the tail end of writing this. And I still had all the same feelings about, I was fearful to see him and I was worried that, something gross would happen while I was there in the hospital room, or that he would be crying and that would be uncomfortable. And I still worried about all those things, but I just sort of pushed through because I felt like, and I worried I'd bumble around and say the wrong things, and I'm sure I did. But I just sort of pushed through because I felt like, from what everyone had said to me, that it was better to be there, and that Mark would tell me to bugger off if I was being a bumbling, annoying person. And yeah, I don't know, it sort of liberated me a bit learning about that.
So in other words, putting the focus on the individual that you're actually there to care for.
And also never say to people, well, just let me know if I can do anything, or give me a ring. Like, who doesn't want a lasagna dropped off on their front door? Just do it. Like, just drop it. Stuff like that is just do it, and don't, or just say, I'm going to come and take the kids out for 2 hours. Who doesn't want their kids taken off their hands for 2 hours?
Well, no, you mentioned Father Sin, but there were actually a number of people that you spoke to who were seminal in helping people through a really traumatic crisis. Did you find some sort of common thread with these people?
Funnily enough, I thought that anyone that I spoke to who worked in what I'd call the death business, so I interviewed the state coroner in New South Wales, a homicide detective, a woman who works at the morgue, the priest. I thought that they would all be really sort of depressed people, and they were actually the opposite. They were all really people who knew how to live in the moment and really appreciated life, because the constant exposure to death constantly reaffirmed what was important in life. So they were sort of the opposite to what I'd expected. And in fact, the coroner, Mary Jerram, I said to her, isn't it depressing? Because coroners always investigate weird and unusual deaths. And she said, it's not depressing, it makes you anxious, because you see all these things you've never thought of, ways that people could die. And so there's also, she said, common things that come up in cases quite often. So she said, for example, she said if someone leaves the bathroom to go to the toilet and they take a long time, she starts feeling anxious, because it's a very common thing in cases that would come before the coroner, that someone went to the bathroom and they've had a heart attack or something's happened and they haven't come back. So she said she always gets a niggle. Or things like if she leaves the house and she hasn't washed up her coffee cup in the sink, she always thinks, oh God, I'm probably going to die today, because she said the police reports are always full of things like there was an unwashed coffee cup in the sink.
So is your kitchen meticulous now?
Right, yeah.
You touch on this question of how we handle death, and you talk about how removed we are, and it's a really interesting thing. There seems to be much more of a conversation that's happening more broadly, I think, about the way that we handle death and how removed we are from it. There's a sense, I think, that compared to other cultures, we're too far away from it, and that's why we're so fearful.
Yeah, and the priest certainly held that view very strongly. He said that we have to be around, dead bodies and say goodbye and all of that sort of stuff, because he said it's just very important, firstly, just to understand that that's part of life, but also just to understand the reality. And there's research that backs it as well, that if you go to a viewing at the morgue to see the body of a loved one, that actually correlates with better coping in the long run. There's lots of factors that come into play though, so it's not, that's not like a golden rule. But the main thing as well is that it's important that your wishes aren't ignored in either direction. So if you feel very strongly that you don't want to see, say, the body of your mother, and someone talks you into it and you do, that's not good. You should be allowed to do what you want. Equally, if you want to see the body and someone talks you out of it, that's also not good. But generally speaking, if you're able to, it is better to see somebody because it helps your brain. Your brain does some really weird stuff to try to avoid accepting that the person has actually died, and seeing that they have died does force your brain to begin to process that. So Steve's instinct that it's better to be there or it's better to see the person, there is research that backs that.
And one of the people you spoke to, Juliet, I've forgotten her last
Darling.
name, she very much had these images in her head about what had happened to her partner.
Yeah.
But the reality was actually better than her imagination.
And that is often the case. And so the best practice now, if you go to the morgue for a viewing, they will, before you go in, they will describe to you in a lot of detail what you're about to see. So they'll say, okay, your he's lied out, he's facing left to right, he has a green sheet over him, his head's been shaved, he has a large scar that's running, blah, blah, blah. They will explain all of that because it apparently mitigates against your imagination. Your imagination usually will present things that are far worse. So in the case of Juliet Darling, her partner, Nick, had been murdered, and she'd had for a couple of years these really, like a sort of waking nightmare where she would replay in her head what she thought had happened. And she just was going crazy with it. And so she decided, I need to go and I just want to see the crime scene photos. Maybe it'll help. So she went and they did the same practice that I just described, where they would describe, now you're going to see Nick's wrist, it's cut to the bone, you can see bone and his watch is on the ground or whatever. They'd give her the photo, she'd look at it. And for her it was unbelievably helpful because what happened was she realised, oh, this is nothing like in my head what I had been imagining. And what she realised was the way she was imagining it subconsciously, because she could visualise it, it was like she was there. And she was thinking subconsciously, if you were there, why didn't you do something to stop it? When she saw the photos, she realised, I wasn't there. I couldn't have stopped it. And so it actually sort of just triggered for her an ability to have an understanding of what happened, and then her brain was able to process it a little bit better.
Yeah, whereas instinctively you'd want to protect her from that material. It's interesting, isn't it?
Yeah.
So let's sort of look at resilience, because that was a really big element of, I guess, your exploration and the answers that you were looking for. What determines how we cope with an extreme trauma, a blindside?
The first thing is the nature of the event itself, because there is a hierarchy of suffering, and some events are worse to deal with than others. Witnessing the violent death of a loved one is a very difficult one to come back from. So the scale of the event itself. Then it's also things like what life experiences you have had. And again, these are generalisations, so of course there's examples that violate this. But if you've had largely, say the Link Cafe, you've had largely a very positive life and a loving family and everything's been pretty good, and then you're hostage in the Link Cafe, if on the other side you're probably more likely to recover okay and not have PTSD, because your brain's likely to view that as an aberration in the way the world works, because generally you think the world is a benign, pretty safe, kind place. If you've had a life with already a lot of trauma and bad things happen, it affirms to you that the world is an unsafe and scary place. And so, there's the cumulative effect, I guess, of the trauma that you've had. There's other things like personality accounts for about 50%. So an optimistic person is more likely to cope better because they're more likely to try to see a good side or to find meaning or purpose in it. As Stuart said, he was a fairly resilient type A personality, and so that correlates well. Women generally cope better than men because it's very useful to talk about things with people, and women are more likely to talk through things with their friends. People that have any form of creative expression, even if you just write for yourself in a diary or something, it's good. Facebook, like support groups and things online, can be very helpful
because
to people.
they're anonymous.
They're anonymous, so you can say what you think and you can find other people who've had a similar experience. And just the act of having to write a post helps your brain to put something in language, and then that helps to process it. So all of those things correlate, but again, unfortunately, you don't really know until you're
there.
on the other side.
You mentioned PTSD, and we hear a lot about it in news now, but what you found was actually that's a very small percentage of people.
Yeah.
In fact, most people come through these blindsides with post-traumatic growth.
Yeah. So about 1 in 10 will get PTSD. That's for a civilian having a random bad experience. If you're police, ambulance, whatever, much higher incidence of PTSD because of the repeated exposure. And I was surprised by this because there's so much reporting about PTSD. I had assumed that if you found yourself in a plane crash or a Lindt cafe that you would get PTSD. But actually only everyone gets traumatised to differing degrees, but actual, clinical, obtrusive, recurrent thoughts, inability to function, all of that sort of stuff is about 1 in 10. So yeah, your chances of developing that is not super common.
And what does growth look like? What does post-traumatic growth look like?
I guess the best way to describe it is the unwanted byproducts of a terrible event. So generally the studies show things like people have increased empathy because they get the understanding that you're not unique and you're not special and you don't have, it's not like, oh, that could happen to them, but it wouldn't happen to me. So you become more empathetic. You'll often have a better ability to live in the moment because you understand the value of, appreciating what you've got because it can be taken away from you at any time. So those tend to be the sort of positive effects that people have when something really terrible has happened to them. But any person in this book would gladly give up any positive growth to just not have the event. You know what I mean? It's not like it's not like, oh, well, it was actually a positive. No, it's always horrendous. Yeah. It's awful. You don't want these things to happen to you. It's just a byproduct that when these things happen to you, you do often come out with some enhanced human qualities.
Sometimes what we see is people making positive action to make, I guess, find some meaning or to get some good out of it. And so we saw Rosie Batty, for example, lead a national campaign against domestic and family violence. Walter Mikak established the foundation on behalf of his daughters. Mm-hmm. And they're very, very positive. And I'm just thinking, we do it in a way, as a whole society as well. When something goes wrong, we look to change things. We set up community support groups. We try to find a positive way through it.
Yeah, and that's again about restoring a sense of order and control and feeling that, life is mostly good and not mostly bad. So, but I think as well, it's important that people are not put under pressure to feel, like one of the things I really hate is, the sort of tyranny of positive thinking, like, oh, you've got cancer, or you just got to think positive and, you're going to beat this thing. Like, what a load of bullshit. It's just positive. There is evidence that having a positive nature, as I said, optimistic people do come through things better. But having a positive nature or being positive does not in and of itself fix things. If you are that way inclined, it's helpful. But what's really unhelpful is if you're not feeling very positive and some idiot's telling you all the time, you just got to be positive. Like, that is the most unhelpful thing.
So going through this journey, do you feel less fearful now? Or do you understand your fear better?
Bizarrely, I feel less fearful, even though I've immersed in just every example of the worst thing that can happen to you. Because I've talked to all these people and I see that all those frozen moments on the news of people suffering that you see is not, for most people, how the rest of their life plays out. Human beings, I'm just amazed at how adaptable people are and how all these things coexist in human life at once, that you have people like Walter and Stuart and everyone, they have pain and they have suffering, as do, I'm sure, tons of people in this room, but doesn't mean that you don't ever have joy and happiness again in your life. It's like these things all coexist at the same time. Whereas I think subconsciously I must have thought before that, when that happens to you, that's the end of every good part of your life. But actually, no, it's not. It all just keeps, sort of chugging along together somehow. So I think I feel, I sort of dread the next awful thing happening to me. And because you're a human being and you're alive, that I'm not going to go through the next, if I'm lucky, 30 years and nothing bad's ever going to happen to me again. But I feel a bit more like, as much as I dread it, that I'll probably be okay.
You've got that resilience.
Yeah, I just feel like, and I had a good lesson in this because my father died just before this book was about to come out. And I I understood all the ways I was acting and what was going on because I'd done all this research, and so I knew, and even things like seeing his body and being there when he died and all of that, I was heavily influenced by what I'd read, and I felt like I really want to do that, and I need to do that. And I was really glad that I had. So I understood intellectually all the ways I was thinking, but it didn't stop me from behaving and grieving and all that sort of stuff. Like, the understanding doesn't stop the emotional process. It's still very painful and all that sort of stuff. But I don't know, it's sort of, for me, there's like a degree of comfort in sort of just understanding, like, yep, I'm irrational and I can't focus and I can't do anything, but that is normal. So, yeah.
It's been a fascinating conversation, thank you, and it's
Thank
a great
you.
book.